Thanks a lot. Thanks for the nice introduction. I did not realize you were going to discuss my podcast, but thanks nonetheless. Thanks everyone for being here. First and foremost, I'm a radiation oncologist. As she said, I'm not a laboratory researcher or whatnot, so I treat patients, and that's mostly what I'm going to deal with tonight. I have no conflicts of interest. And, my goals are to briefly review the historical data on diet and cancer care. This is going to be less geared toward prevention, more towards treatment. My goal is to convince the listener that diet and nutrition play a role in cancer care, hopefully an integral role. To briefly review existing data supporting nutritional intervention in cancer care. And lastly, to explore future directions of diet in the management of cancer. And for those of you that have been looking into this online, in books, et cetera, there's been 5 main areas in the dietary world that have been looked at recently in terms of increasing the efficacy of cancer treatment. First and foremost, a low carbohydrate diet, a ketogenic diet, intermittent fasting, calorie restriction, and a low fat diet. Just to give you some background about me, I was raised in a household where diet, nutrition, exercise, these kind of things were basically at the forefront of medicine. In fact, my grandfather, a week before he passed away, someone asked him how he lived so long. He was 96. And he said, this was to a physician, he said, "I stayed away from people like you," pointing at them. So we were not a family that liked doctors. And so these first 3, which I'm going to talk in depth about, and I know this was discussed by Dr. D'Agostino, I think these 3 are actually, to a degree, interchangeable, and I'm going to try to convince you of that. Calorie restriction has been a hot topic, and if I have time at the end, I'll touch on that. And then low-fat diet I'm not going to talk about because, frankly, there's just not a lot of great data to support it. So I'm a radiation oncologist. I see a lot of different types of patients. I mostly see breast cancer patients. They're treated anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks of radiation every day, Monday through Friday. It's great. I see people day in and day out. I forge great relationships with my patients. They ask me a lot of questions. These are the 3 most common questions I get. Can I drink alcohol? Can I have sex? And what should I eat? Will different foods interact with my treatment? Now, to rewind a bit, after my upbringing, which, again, had a strong influence of diet, exercise, nutrition, these kind of things. In medical school, we're not really taught much of that at all. And then during my cancer training, we're really taught that there's probably no relationship between the 2, or between the 3. So when I was getting asked these questions, it really kind of brought me back to my days as a child and made me really think, there must be something here. Why are people so interested in this? So first and foremost, when I go to answer these questions, the second one's easy. It depends. The third one, I had no clue what to say. I mean, I know what my heart believed, but there really was not a lot of data. And interestingly enough, we have more data for the first one than the third one. And granted, I love this study. This is in our big red journal. I love Italians. I love wine. This study basically showed that women being treated for breast cancer, drinking 1 glass of red wine per day, had lower toxicity from the radiation than those not drinking any wine. The bad news is if you drink 2 or more glasses, that benefit's negated. So 1 glass of wine, and it's great because I get to tell my patients to drink wine. So it's pretty amazing. I love the paper, but it's also a bit sad that there's not more data that I could turn to tell patients what they should eat. I can tell them what they should drink, but what they should eat, I'm not really sure about. There is a conflict of interest. This is where the study took place, in the wine capital of the world, so keep that in mind. So in my practice, actually during my residency in Philadelphia, we took a step back and we decided to ask our patients where they were going for dietary recommendations, since we sure as heck didn't know what to tell them. And the vast majority of patients were interested in diet, and the vast majority of patients, lo and behold, went online to find out what they should do about diet and nutrition. So we said, let's see what patients are being told, where are they going? We went to the 22 NCCN cancer centers. These are the creme de la creme of cancer centers. We went to their online websites and found that only 4 of the 22 even had dietary recommendations. And then of the remainders, some did reference 4 other external sites. And these are the 8 sites here. And when I published this paper, I was applying for jobs. And I had the sites' names below there, and I was applying for jobs at some of these places, and I said very unflattering things about them. So I've now replaced it with numbers. So basically, as you can see here, this is representing the quantification of these recommendations. So carbohydrate versus protein versus fat. We looked at the quality of foods. We looked at whether they said a low-fat diet, a high-fat diet, et cetera. And as you could see, it's all over the map, and cancer patients don't know what the heck to think. On the far left there, number 10 and 11, those were cancer centers. I don't want to name names, but they're up in the New England area, and they stress their H's quite a bit. They were pushing a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. This is what would be considered a cardiac prudent diet, and I would question whether that's even the case, but Dr. Volek touched on that a couple months ago with you all. That's what they're recommending. Now, if you go over to the West Coast, 32 and 31 there, they were recommending more of a moderate diet, a third, or a high-fat diet. And this is the traditional, we don't want cancer patients to lose weight during treatment, so we want them to eat a lot of different types of foods or a lot of fat. But as you can see, quite a bit of heterogeneity. And if I were a cancer patient looking at this, I would not know where to even start. I thought this was a very important paper, again, knowing my biases. So I submitted it to a very important journal, and they rejected it in literally 5 days. It was the quickest rejection I've ever received from a journal. And these were the 2 responses I got, quite brief as well. The first was, we don't have any data showing an effect of diet on cancer treatment or outcomes. And I think this is probably what the vast majority of researchers and clinicians believe. Secondly, they said diet is unlikely to play any part in cancer care. Therefore, this article is irrelevant for this journal. It was a journal of cancer. So that one cut to the core. That one really hurt my feelings. I submitted it to another journal called Nutrition and Cancer, which is a fine journal as well. It got accepted there and it got published, but I had high hopes for it, so I was very discouraged after this, bitter to a degree. And then the calls started pouring in. American Society of Clinical Oncology called and interviewed me and did an article in their monthly paper. The National Cancer Institute put a flyer out saying, what's going on here? We need more research on what patients should eat. Medline did an article as well. And then the most important peer-reviewed journal, the Sanjay Gupta Guide, did an article as well. And that last one actually got the ball rolling. It's amazing how people work. But the key here is that patients want to know the answers to these questions. So as physicians who are treating patients, it's our responsibility to provide some answers. So in response to the first person that rejected me, I want them to look to this paper, wherever they are. This is from 1909, if you see in the middle there. And this is Dr. Moreshi from Germany. And he took 4 groups of mice. Let me switch this up here. He took 4 groups of mice and then decreased their feed intake, okay? So the bottom there is ad libitum. That means you can eat whatever you want, as much as you want all day long. And then as you can see, each step up is a stepwise decrease in the amount of food that he let these mice eat. Then he implanted sarcomas, which are a muscular type tumor, in the mice, and basically showed that the mice that ate whatever they wanted had a much larger growth of their tumors than the mice that were calorically restricted. This was the first paper that I know of showing a direct link between diet and cancer, one that apparently not many people know about, but that's over 100 years old. To put it in some context, that's the same year that Geronimo, the Apache chief, passed away, and St. Joan of Arc was beatified. So I'd say we do have some data, and it's quite old. The next year, Dr. Peyton Roos, who later won a Nobel Prize for showing that a virus can cause cancer, said, let's look at this from a oncologist or a physician point of view. So he grew the tumor first, so that would be like a patient coming in for consultation. And at that point, he did a dietary restriction. And he showed that there was slower growth in mice that had their diet restricted. And it's questionable what he restricted, but he definitely restricted calories overall. Albert Tannenbaum, over the next 50 years, made quite a bit of advances in the field. He basically measured different types of food, measured the mice very meticulously, showing that when you decrease their we'll say calories for now, we'll get into that for a minute. There's a 2 to 44 times lower spontaneous growth in these dietary restricted mice. I don't have a picture of him. That is the mobster, Albert Tannenbaum, that was arrested in New York City. And last but not least, this is 2002 now, so we're at about the century mark. Dr. Stephen Hursting and his group said calorie restriction might be a little tough in cancer patients. Let's do fasting 1 day per week. That's probably a little bit easier. And he showed that it worked as well. And interestingly, and importantly, he showed that you can measure it. He started measuring, first off, cancer incidence, but he measured IGF. And we're going to get into this. But he showed that mice that were fasted 1 day per week had a decrease in a quantifiable number. And I'm going to explain what that is in a minute here. Just another way to view it, these are 4 of the hundreds of studies that have shown a link between diet and cancer that a lot of scientists and oncologists just aren't aware of. And if we take a closer look at Dr. Tannenbaum's work, this is 1947, so what is that, 60-some years ago. He meticulously looked at not just calories that he restricted in these mice, but what he restricted. And what he did in this study, and you could see how rudimentary it is, the graph was done with paper and pencil. He looked at mice that were given a carcinogen, and then how often cancer happened. And that's what the highest bar there is, the dark part and the hatched part. And then the bottom of the dark part was what happened when he restricted calories in these mice. And this was usually, he would restrict 30 to 50% of the calories the mice ate, and then he would apply a carcinogen, and then show that they had decreased cancer occurrence after that. What he started to realize, what you see here, and most people don't know, is that the C's are carbohydrates. That was where the biggest decrease in cancer occurred, when he restricted carbohydrates. And he actually oftentimes switched out the carbohydrates for fat. So in some of these mice, there probably wasn't even calorie restriction. The calories may have gone up. The key was that carbohydrates were restricted. And he's not the only one that started to notice this. Dr. Crabtree, 1929, commented on the observation of carbohydrate metabolism in tumors. He started to realize that tumors had a penchant for sugar. They needed sugar. And below there's Dr. Warburg, who won a Nobel Prize as well for mitochondrial research. Those are the powerhouses of our cells. His whole theory was that cancer occurrence happened because of faulty mitochondria and a reliance on sugar. It's called the Warburg hypothesis, which is recently, if you Google it, has gained a lot of momentum. And even stepping into my area of the ring here, this is Dr. Kramer and Crabtree, 1933. This is before chemotherapy even existed. That came later with World War II. When we were using radiation, they started to do studies when they realized that with sugar present, cancer cells were much more resistant to radiation. 1933. Again, chemotherapy wasn't around. 1940, the treatment that they started to look at, this is Dr. Crabtree again, were chemicals that would block the ability of cancer cells to use glucose. These were not toxic chemotherapies or toxic radiation that bombards them with free radicals, but rather a metabolic type of treatment. Another one, this is Dr. Kramer again with Dr. Woodward. They looked at this glucose analog called 2DG, and it's like a glucose cork. When a cell takes it up, it binds where glucose would bind, and then it blocks further glucose uptake. And what it basically does here is decrease the amount of glycolysis or sugar breakdown that cancer cells are able to do. Unfortunately, it also does it in normal cells too, so it is not a non-toxic drug. But that is, again, this is before the 1950s, before we even had chemotherapy. So why does this happen? I'll try not to be too sciencey here with some of my slides because they can get confusing. But basically, carbohydrates and sugar increase insulin in the blood. So if you eat carbohydrates, if you eat a cookie, your blood sugar rises. If your blood sugar gets too high, it will be fatal. So your body secretes a chemical called insulin. It's a hormone, and it pulls glucose out of your blood and into your cells so that you go back to a state of normalcy. Glucose, insulin, and a substance called IGF, that's what Dr. Hursting was measuring, can all bind to these receptors on cancer cells and activate this pathway that causes cell survival, cell growth, and inflammation, thus causing cancer, allowing cancer to be immune to chemotherapy and radiation, or causing it to metastasize or do other nasty things. Simply by increasing insulin sensitivity, which you can do through carbohydrate restriction, through other things. Less of it is floating around in the blood because if your blood sugar is not going high, you don't need it. Therefore, it's not binding to these pathways. And this is from a paper that I wrote. All these IFs next to these, if you do carbohydrate restriction or even intermittent fasting, it basically modulates all those pathways to make cancer cells more killable by radiation and chemotherapy. Simply put, this is from a pictogram that I like. So excess carbohydrates and sugar in the diet cause excess insulin. Insulin is an anabolic hormone. It makes things grow. It makes cancer cells grow. It makes your belly grow. You get obesity from it. It causes inflammation. It causes diabetes. And it causes cancer. Interestingly, this is nothing new. My 93-year-old grandma could tell you this. Leo Tolstoy knew about this, and he wrote about it in the 1870s in the book Anna Karenina, when he talks about Vronsky, who was always training in the book, for those of you that read it. He had no need to be in strict training, as he had very quickly been brought down to the required weight of 160 pounds, but still he had to avoid gaining weight, and he avoided starchy foods and desserts. Later on, this became Atkins. Dr. Volek gave, for those who were there, a great talk on this a couple months ago. Insulin makes things grow, cancer cells and fat cells. This is from Dr. Volek's work, and actually, we know what happens when we decrease the amount of these substances in the diet. In fact, we know in randomized trials, and this is from data from non-cancer patients. This is actually one of Dr. Volek's studies. There's dozens of these. If you compare a low-fat diet, this is kind of what we've been telling people to eat for about 30 years now. It's the lighter gray there, low-fat diet, or a very low carbohydrate, what's called a ketogenic diet, which Dr. D'Agostino and Dr. Volek spoke about as well. Here's what happens. Your circulating glucose drops by about 13%. And again, this is in human. This is not a mouse study. And your insulin levels drop by over 52%. Okay, so if we know that they can bind and upregulate cancer cell growth, it's only logical to a degree that manipulating the diet can affect cancer, both growth and treatment. A ketogenic diet, I'll speak very briefly about this, is less than 20 grams to 50 grams of carbohydrates a day, and that's even questionable, with about 70 to 80% of fat. So it's quite a high amount of fat. Again, if you don't eat carbohydrates, you have to eat something. In this case, it's fat. It aggressively lowers blood sugar levels, insulin and IGF levels, that cancer pathway, and it upregulates this other enzyme called AMP kinase. And if I have time, I'll get into that. I put in this slide not to gross you out, but just to stress the low carbohydrate, high fat element of this diet. This is the Maasai. They're a hunter-gatherer, and a lot of these peoples like that, the hunter-gatherers, the Eskimos, etc., ate this diet. This was actually after two of my friends gave them a goat to say thank you for letting them spend the day with them. They opened the goat up, drank its blood, and they ate all the organs because they subscribed to a high-fat diet, and they threw the rest of the goat back to my friends saying, here, you can have the scraps. So a very high-fat diet, and this is likely the diet that kept many of our ancestors alive over the past million years or so, during the 6 months of winter when carbohydrates weren't available. It was only animals, higher fat types of foods. It's a normal physiologic mechanism. And the data, now this is from a retrospective study, the data is telling us showing us what happens when our blood glucose levels are high. This is from Johns Hopkins University, and this is in patients with glioblastoma multiforme, which is a very, very aggressive brain tumor. And what they did is they went back and looked through all of their patients that were treated with surgery and then the chemotherapy and then the radiation, and they measured their glucose levels. The yellow here is patients that had average glucose higher than 137. The blue here are patients that had an average glucose less than 94. Now the survival is not great here regardless, and we need to increase our treatment options for this. But if you had a glucose less than 94, you live twice as long as if you had a glucose greater than 137. This was accounting for steroid usage. So patients with high blood sugar levels live a lot shorter than patients with low blood sugar levels. So why is that? What is the connection between glucose, blood sugar, and cancer cells? And this goes back to Warburg. He's a gentleman whose picture I showed you, and the Warburg hypothesis. So ignore the right side here for now. But if you think about this is just going to be a normal muscle. Think about your thigh muscle, and it's a million years ago, and a lion's running after you, so you run as fast as you can to get away from that lion. So there's no oxygen in your thighs, in your quad muscle as it's pumping away, but it needs to make energy to keep contracting. So what it does is called anaerobic glycolysis. It breaks glucose directly down to make 2 moles of ATP. ATP are these energy molecules, and it gives off lactic acid. So what happens when you sprint, your thighs start to burn. That is a way to make energy. It's a survival mechanism. It's not quite that efficient, though. You get 2 moles of ATP per mole of glucose. If oxygen is present, you can take things like glucose. You can also take things like fats. You can take things like ketones, shuttle them into the mitochondria, the powerhouses of our cells, and make 36 moles of ATP per mole of glucose. Okay, this happens in all of us. If you take cancer cells, they do not care if oxygen is present or not. They take glucose, they break it down as quickly as possible to lactate, and they just keep trying to grow and just keep trying to grow. This is the Warburg effect. And this is what separates cancer cells from normal cells. And this is likely why if you have a lot more blood sugar floating around for these cancer cells, you're going to do a lot worse with treatment. A lot of people have commented on Aboriginal peoples, hunter-gatherers, et cetera, and how they don't see cancer in a lot of these groups. Many people have said it's from this very Warburg hypothesis. Less clear. Interesting nonetheless. This is from Dr. Urquhart, who lived with the Eskimos for quite a while, 7 years, and he says, as regards cancer, I've not in my 7 years experience in the North seen a single case of malignancy in either Eskimo or Indian. People questioned him, saying, you don't have the diagnostic techniques we do, and he said, yes, we do. As for the hospitals, the natives appreciate them to the utmost and use them freely. He actually, they got appendicitis a lot. He would take their appendix out. He also had x-rays and other ways to examine these patients. And he says, it is for someone else to explain this absence of cancer amongst these people. That was 1935. I think it's time we actually do explain that absence. And Dr. Fine some amazing work has been done by Dr. Fine in this field. He did one of the first ketogenic diet studies in cancer patients. This is 10 patients that had advanced cancer. They were not getting any treatment with chemotherapy or radiation therapy. They were all put on a ketogenic diet, or all attempted to be put on a ketogenic diet. He basically showed, again, with a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, you get the more ketones these patients were making, the less amount of insulin they were experiencing. So basically, the higher ketones you can make, the less insulin you have to bind to those cancer cells, to increase cancer growth, to make them more resistant to chemotherapy and radiation therapy. This is from our study that we did back when I was in Philadelphia. This is in mice, so keep that in mind. This is not in humans. But we basically found that, we implanted breast tumors on these mice, and then we had them eat sorry, this is dying. In the middle there on the blue, it's an ad libitum diet, so they got to eat whatever they wanted. Then we gave them a single dose of 8 gray of radiation, not a curative dose by any means, but enough to blunt tumor growth. And that resulted in this, so less tumor growth, and it was slower. Then we fasted them by 30%. It actually had a greater effect on tumor growth than radiation. Again, not a curative dose of radiation. And then when we combined the treatments, calorie restriction was synergistic with radiation. The mice did start to lose weight, though, so it's somewhat concerning. So we looked at doing intermittent fasting, just like Dr. Hursting. This was every other day fasts. If we look at the bottom, the mice initially lost weight, caught up to it. Again, eating an ad libitum diet, tumor grows pretty quickly to a large size. Alternate day feeding and radiation were about the same, and they worked synergistically. If you fast a mouse every other day and treat them with radiation, the tumor grows significantly slower. One thing to keep in mind, anytime you see these mouse studies, that's how much a 200-pound mouse would eat in a day, 40 pounds. I weigh about that much, and I'm pretty sure I don't eat that much. So 30% caloric restriction in a mouse is probably not the same in a human. So keep that in mind. Also, for those of you that are going to go home and look online and Google these things, this is a general diet that mice receive on these studies, okay? One thing you'll note, 20%, this is dying. It's only 20% protein, 13% fat, almost 70% carbohydrates. So is it calorie restriction, or is it, looking back at Tannenbaum and some of these other studies, carbohydrate restriction? And this is just a great study. This is from the Barrow Institute out in Arizona. So they took it to the next level. These are not calorically restricted mice, but these are mice that, if you look at the top left there, they implanted brain tumors just like the glioblastomas and put them on a ketogenic diet. The mice live significantly longer on this diet, again favoring glucose necessity for brain tumors to live and thrive. However, when they took 22 more mice and put half of them on the standard of care, that's a standard diet and radiation therapy, and compared that with a ketogenic diet and radiation therapy, these mice live significantly longer. And in fact, at the end of the study, at 250 days, 9 mice were still alive. They were sacrificed. And when they looked on pathology or histology in the brain, there was no sign of tumor. So 9 of the 11 mice were quote-unquote cured. Now, this isn't a mouse study, and we've cured cancer many times in mice. But this shows just from diet alone, there's quite a significant difference. And one of those mice in the study, when they had no signs of tumor, I think it was at about 100 days, they put them back on a normal diet. And then when they sacrificed them 150 days later, there was still no sign of tumor, potentially saying that not only can it cure, then you can go back to a normal diet. So this is a very big deal for the field of radiation, even though it is a mouse study. So we're trying to get this going in humans now. And it's very difficult to run diet studies in humans for many reasons. It's difficult to fund them, and it is difficult to get people to eat a certain way. Some would say impossible. Dr. Volek was very successful at it, so hopefully we can extrapolate that to the cancer world. This is a paper that I published last year looking at our first handful of patients with a glioblastoma, just like the mice, that underwent treatment with radiation and chemotherapy to the brain while undergoing a ketogenic diet. This was more of a safety paper. You'd be surprised how when people hear that you're going to put cancer patients on a certain diet, they get very scared. We can throw crazy doses of radiation and chemotherapy at patients, but if you cut carbs, it's unbelievable. So this paper was merely to show that it's safe and to show that it'll have an effect. And so it's just basic reporting, nothing more. We showed all of our patients with GBMs. This is before surgery. And these 2 blood glucose lines are the numbers from that study I showed you. Patients with a blood glucose less than this live significantly longer than patients with a blood glucose greater than that. So we just wanted to see where our patients were. Before surgery, they're right at about that point where patients generally do worse. Before radiation, they're well over there, and there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of them have gotten craniotomy surgeries. They're on steroids, which can raise blood glucose. And then we just looked at all of our patients, their average blood glucose during treatment. So a normal range is here. The average blood glucose range here is about, I think it's about 128, so quite high, well above that point where we want them to be below. And then we compare that with our patients on the ketogenic diet. And as you can see, this is just the average blood glucose, which was about 81 or 82, is well below that mark. And this is just through diet alone. A lot of these patients were on high-dose steroids, and it still didn't cause their blood glucose to go high. One patient who had we'll call it a cheat day, and a little bit of a binge fest, his blood glucose went that high, which was still below that mark that we want. So now we don't know if this is going to lead to longer survivals, et cetera, but we do know that metabolically it's getting these patients within the range that we want, actually well below the range that we want. And this is with diet alone. This is generally what they ate. This is from a patient who I tracked. 77% was fat. It's the big black part of the pie chart there. 8% was carbohydrate, and 15% was protein. This is an average meal. Coffee and cream for breakfast. 3 eggs, bacon, cooked broccoli. Not too bad, it's a big breakfast. For lunch, a Greek salad, olive oil, and then, sorry about that, for dinner, coconut oil, cooked kale, salmon, and a snack of macadamia nuts. So not bad, that's a good day. So last but not least, I have a little bit of time left here. I'm going to talk about this other pathway, and this is a new kid on the block, and this is the AMP kinase pathway. So I think it's fairly obvious what happens with carbohydrates and insulin in this pathway, and there's a lot more data than I presented here showing that effect. The question is this new pathway, AMP kinase, and I have a caveman next to that because this is kind of the caveman pathway. So this is upregulated during periods of starvation, when you don't have food. When you're running away really fast from a lion, AMP kinase is upregulated. Some would say calorie restriction upregulates AMP kinase. So it's almost this, and I mean this in the scientific term, an evolutionary process of survival. It blocks this pathway. This is mTOR, and we spend millions upon millions of dollars a year coming up with drugs like rapamycin and other drugs that block that pathway. Well, there's significant data showing that diet and exercise can do that in itself, and that may make these cancer cells more susceptible to killing by chemotherapy and radiation. Basically what AMP kinase does, again, upregulated with fasting or calorie restriction, decreasing carbohydrates, and intense exercise, causes sugar breakdown. So that in itself may be one of the reasons why patients would do better. It stops the production of sugar, which is gluconeogenesis, so there's less sugar floating around in your body. It breaks down fat, breaks down cholesterol, so that's obviously always a good thing. And then it blocks this pathway and blocks this pathway, which can upregulate cancer growth. And finally, it leads to mitochondrial biogenesis. Those are the powerhouses of our cells. And there is some data, though controversial, that shows they may provide a lot of cancer-fighting capability. This is my last message before I finish here. So we really explored whether calories or carbohydrates count with the insulin pathway. And I think it's fairly obvious that carbohydrates are the issue there, more so than calories. And we are a calorie-dominated society. So what about with AMP kinase? Earlier studies are saying if you cut calories, you can get this pathway fixed. This is a great study. So there's two studies in one here. These are 18 overweight individuals, all agreed to go through this study and get pieces of their muscle biopsied to assess for the study. So kudos to them. And they were placed on a 5-day eucaloric diet, which meant same calories every day. And it was 50% carbohydrates, 30% fat, and 20% protein. It's a standard American diet. And they wanted to see what happens to this AMP kinase when we do a 30% calorie restriction, so similar to those past studies that I talked about, Tannenbaum and those guys. But they said, let's look at the difference in not just calories, but macronutrients. So this diet is more of a physician-approved, unfortunately, diet, where carbohydrates were increased to 60%, fat was increased to 20%, and protein was staying at 20%. And then this diet is more looking at Tannenbaum's type of data. They decreased carbohydrates to 30%. Fat went up to 50%. So a high-fat, low-carbohydrate versus a high-carbohydrate, low-fat diet with 30% calorie reduction. So that if calories mattered that much, it shouldn't matter what you did there. Interestingly, AMP kinase was downregulated in the high-carbohydrate diet, even in the face of calorie restriction. And AMP kinase was upregulated in the higher fat diet. Okay, so cutting calories with a high fat diet can increase a pathway that may make cancer cells more sensitive to treatment with radiation or chemotherapy. So they took it to the next step and said, what about in 21 lean individuals, no health issues, we'll do the same exact study with the same exact change, but for 5 days they can binge eat and increase their calories by 40%. Okay, enough to make most physicians stroke out. Yet, they show the same thing. AMP kinase is upregulated even in overconsumption of food. Again, taking the crosshairs off of calories and placing them on carbohydrates. So this is just something to think about. This is a new kid on the block. There's going to be more data coming out regarding that. But it's interesting nonetheless. We wrote a whole paper on this. It's calories, carbohydrates, and cancer therapy with radiation. You can Google it. It's free. We paid to have it free, so it's open access for everyone. And this is just one of the pictures showing all the effects of all these different things, including protein restriction on cancer. Last but not least, before closing, a quote that I love by Hippocrates: "It is important to know what sort of person has a disease than to know what sort of disease a person has." This is a study from patients that were diagnosed with lung cancer, again, a very aggressive lung cancer. The difference between these two groups, the only difference was that after psychiatric evaluation, the people in the green, who as you see here lived significantly longer, at 2 years, at 5 years, and at 9 years, were very positive and optimistic, whereas the people in the orange were very pessimistic. That was the only difference they could find between these two groups of people. The positive people live significantly longer than the pessimistic people. The key thing here is it also favors the importance of the active patient. So I get patients that come in with a glioblastoma, which is it's life-changing to the entire family. It's such an aggressive disease. And they come in roaring to go with their little diet journals. They're ready to tell me about what they're eating. The family members are all involved. It's no longer them sitting there while I irradiate them and the oncologist gives them chemotherapy and they're so sick and it's too bad you have to get to this dose. Now they're in the front seat of their care. And we don't know what benefit that's going to provide. I know it's going to be huge and I don't know how to measure it, but that's something else that we need to look into. So moving forward, again, recapping, the association between diet and cancer has been known for over a century. Sugar can potentially fuel cancer cells and impede its treatment. Diet, whether that's ketogenic, even intermittent fasting, which I didn't get into here, but that's a whole topic in itself, may synergize with current treatments. The role of the active patient and active family cannot be minimized. And we need future clinical trials to answer these questions, to also get those physicians that don't believe to start to believe. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, Dr. Ford for inviting me, and Spang for setting this all up. My great patients, and also want to thank my father's here to hear me speak, and he gave many talks when I was a child, and I was always amazed at what a good public speaker he was, and I was always a very bad public speaker. So to be here presenting to him now is pretty amazing, so thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone. If anyone has any questions, sure, right here.
Now, when you talk about carbs, there's the ones we consider the starches like rice and potatoes and bread, and then there's the broccoli and the celery. Can you address that?
So I guess there's a couple ways to look at it. For a ketogenic diet, it's going to be those numbers, the 20 to 50, and again, this is ballpark. Everyone's very different in that regard. It would be non-fibrous type. So you have to absorb it and it has to raise your glucose levels, et cetera. So broccoli, green leafy vegetables, probably not going to put you over if you're on a strict ketogenic diet. Starchy vegetables versus non-starchy is a very controversial area. In terms of non-fiber, I just count them all as one because everyone's a little bit different. And interestingly, oftentimes people that are not in a ketogenic diet that are attempting to be in one are not eating too many carbohydrates, but they're eating too much protein. People have trouble eating a ton of fat because it's a big switch, not in my Southern Italian family members who cook everything in lard, but it's a big switch from what we've told people to do that's healthy for the last 30 years. So, sure. Sorry.
With your focus on sugar as being a fuel for cancer cells, what is your feeling on artificial sweeteners? Because the American diet seems to be love sweets.
Mm-hmm. So there's not great data whether artificial sweeteners can feed cancer cells. I don't recommend them to patients because I do think that they're telling your brain one thing and they're making it actually more difficult. After you have these fake sweets, then your brain's kind of, you taste them, but then nothing gets digested, and your brain's saying, hey, what's going on here? I paid for this. So then, so it makes a terrible kind of up and down roller coaster. So directly, they stimulate glucose very minimally, so I don't think they're going to necessarily knock people out of ketosis, not the data, not that I'm aware of. But mentally, it's a very big switch to go from a standard American diet to a ketogenic diet. And I think initially sweeteners are fine, but for those that have tried this, you really stop you don't even like sweet foods for a while. If you drink red wine, you will just see, you can't even drink the sweeter wines anymore. You can't drink white wine. You start to really favor non-sweet type foods. So I think sweeteners interfere with that process. Oh, sorry, she's right there.
Hi, we had a speaker here who talked about a ketogenic diet affecting her husband who was developing Alzheimer. Why is there all this impetus all of a sudden on the ketogenic diet and our ordinary diseases that we're starting to face?
So ketogenic diet there's a term called ketoacidosis, and it's when it happens in diabetics when their blood glucose keeps rising and they don't have insulin to bring it in, and they start making ketones because their body thinks that there's no glucose around, and it's a fatal state. It's called ketoacidosis. Literally to this day, when I bring up a ketogenic diet in the hospital setting, someone says, what about it's fatal ketoacidosis? So I think that has created this unnecessary bias against a ketogenic diet and benefits that it could have had. There's actually studies from the 1950s where they're trying ketogenic diet for things. We went so far away from it with our low-fat recommendations. The other thing, too, is it's a normal physiologic state. A lot of us make ketones when we go to bed at night. If you have dinner at 4 o'clock one day and then don't eat again until lunch the next day, you're going to be making ketones. So it's a normal physiologic state in our body. So it's kind of harnessing a natural state. It's questionable whether one should be in it all the time. That's a very controversial area. But also it's been shown to upregulate certain things in our cells that make them better. In that AMP kinase pathway, lowering the insulin pathway, not only does it not make our cells turn into cancer, but it helps brain cells recover from trauma. There's a lot of studies in mice that show if they damage the brain and give them ketones, the brain damage does not happen as much as it should, similar to Alzheimer's or some of these other things. Plus, it's not necessarily all the time that it's ketones, it's what you're not doing. So insulin stimulation, high blood glucose, it creates these things called AGEs in the blood, which just damage all kind of structures. So not being in that state in itself is very helpful. And now I think everyone's really excited, so they're trying to use it for everything. I don't know if it can help everything. I mean, I hope, but so. Oh, right here. Sorry. Sure, yeah, sorry.
This may not really be a correct question for this talk because you didn't go into the intermittent fasting as much. But when you're using a comparison of the intermittent fasting to a ketogenic diet, is the individual doing the intermittent fasting then going back to a regular high carbohydrate, low fat diet, or is it on top of a ketogenic diet?
So it doesn't necessarily have to be on top of a ketogenic diet. Ideally, no one's on a high carbohydrate, low fat diet. I don't think that's necessarily good for anyone because of those pathways. I think even if you're not on a ketogenic diet, and this is my personal opinion, and I do this myself, that I think intermittent fasting has a lot of data backing it.
Okay, so you're talking about intermittent fasting within being in a nutritional ketosis.
Either or, nutritional ketosis or not nutritional ketosis, there's data. There's this study in 10 patients that were getting chemotherapy where they were on a normal diet and they fasted them. It was for a while. It was for, I think, 24 to 36 hours, and they showed decreased side effects.
Do the individuals who are doing the intermittent fasting still get many of the dietary appetite suppression effects of the ketotic diet?
It's, Dr. D'Agostino and I were just talking about this. It depends on the person. I know for me, after 16 hours, if I don't eat, everyone around me will hate me. But some people can do a longer fast, and after a while, they get the appetite suppression. And once the ketosis in itself suppresses appetite, and it does it pretty strongly. And it's actually kind of the reverse issue. Dr. Volek, who talked here, in his studies, he had patients on ketogenic diets, and he said, eat as much as you want, and their calories dropped lower down than people on a low-fat diet. So it all depends on the individual. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thanks, sir. Many years ago, there was some studies conducted among Japanese breast cancer rates, and it found that when they were on traditional Japanese diet of vegetables, fish, and hard physical labor, in other words, post-World War II and through the Korean War, when they came to the United States as war brides and ate the traditional American high-fat diet, that the breast cancer rate went up markedly. Is there any further studies that validate this, or is it a workable hypothesis?
There's a lot of studies showing that when you move to America, the seventh, the Seventh-day Adventist study showed that, compared to a standard American diet and a standard American lifestyle, I think there's a lot of issues. I was actually talking to Dr. Ford about this. We put a lot of hormones in our food. I don't know if that affects it, but breast cancer is a hormone-positive disease. We give our cows a lot of antibiotics. I think there's some dairy issues there as well. There's actually studies showing the amount of estrogens put in livestock in Japan versus livestock in America. In Japan, the graph's like that. In America, the graph's like that. So it's tough to say. I don't think it can be just, vegetables or carbohydrates. Eating more vegetables, of course, is more healthy. And I think if you go around Japan, it's obvious that, especially, I think that was on the, I forget which island that study took place, but clearly they have a healthier lifestyle. So it's a good question. Again, we need to do some trials to show it. If you look back at the one study I showed with Dr. Volek's data, where he looks at body fat, cholesterol levels, blood glucose, all these things, there's so much, it's in the favorable range when they're put on these diets. But then again, is a ketogenic diet that much better, or is a standard American diet that bad? And it's tough to say, but the key is, point well taken, it's a bad diet, it needs changed. Oh, right there.
Are there any clinical trials or studies being done here in Ocala?
There are not that I know of. There's not a lot of studies throughout the U.S., frankly, looking at this. A couple just finished. I'm trying to get one done. It's very difficult to get these studies through both the Institutional Review Board because of fears of toxicity, patient compliance, and these kind of things. So what you get then is a lot of, like, my patient report, or you get these just reporting on 10 patients that were on this diet. Dr. Fine, the one study that I presented, he had 10 patients. I think that took him 5 years to get approved and to get it done. So, part of my talks in general are to rouse some enthusiasm towards getting these studies done. So I don't know of anyone around here, but sure.
Which one?
Do you think there's any difference between a 1 day a week fast and a daily intermittent fast of, say, 14 hours?
I think it's individual based. I know myself, I do them on the weekends. I can't do it during the week with work. It's just not conducive. Again, I get crabby, and there's no data to say one's better than the other. And in that study that we did with the mice, we did alternate day fasts. But again, mice eat, 130% of what we eat in a day or something more than that. So I don't know. I think, it's tough to say whether one's better than the other. Especially back to that other question, depending on what the other diet is. If the other diet is very clean and they're fasting 1 day a week, maybe that's enough. Oh, we got one more there.
Hi. I love your Caveman Doctor site.
Oh, thanks.
And your Facebook. There's so much good information.
Thanks.
I love it. One of my questions was, we're talking about low carb. Well, fruits have a lot of carbs, don't they? As much as pasta and all those kind of things. What do you suggest is good for low carb fruit, or just not eating as much?
So just low carb, not ketogenic?
Right.
So just low carb, I generally turn towards berries, strawberries, blackberries, blueberries, raspberries, because they have the skin on them, so there's higher fiber, less sugar. I shy away from bananas and those kind of things where you're just getting, straight sugar. Avocados I don't really consider them fruit, but in terms of fruit, they're pretty amazing as well. And I'll eat some seasonal fruits as well in the summertime. So apple with the skin on it or whatnot. But I don't eat, other than that, I don't eat a ton of fruits.
And for ketogenic also?
Ketogenic, you got to be really careful, but generally, yeah, blackberries, you'll get a little more bang for your buck. Raspberries and even blueberries, but you got to really watch with those numbers. I mean, green leafy vegetables, it's pretty hard to get yourself out of ketosis with them. So.
With average people's knowledge of nutrition being very minimal, so you have a patient come into you and they want you explain to them some of the diet stuff. Where's your go-to to give them a base of information? Because at least in my experience, as soon as you mention the word, like you say, keto, you get the blank stare. People don't know what you're talking about. And then when you go, well, let me send you to somewhere to get a base of information for somebody that doesn't really have a base of knowledge. Do you have anything like that you typically recommend, or kind of give them I always call it a one-sheeter. Like ideally you need to be able to give people a one-sheeter to be able to say this is kind of the basics of being able to comply. Not in depth, it probably insults people that really know about it, but what do you do with a patient like that?
So for the ketogenic diet, especially with GBM, with glioblastoma, since it's got more notoriety, oftentimes they're coming in asking for it. I have a one-sheeter for that. Breast cancer, I've been completing a handout because I've been pointing people to sources, and again, as I showed you on that graph, the data's all over the place. So it's something that needs to be done. It's very controversial. I don't point people towards a lot of the cancer society's online recommendations because I don't even agree with them. So I kind of have to evaluate. Quite honestly, people come in with a list of this is what I eat, this is the exact, I eat 30% carbohydrates per day, 20% this, these are my ketone levels. You have those kind of people. And then you have kind of the exact opposite. Like I had a patient who I told her she shouldn't eat bread. And then another patient in the waiting room said when she was leaving, she's like, Dr. Champ's crazy. So for that patient, you can't. So it's really difficult. And we're trying to get, like in my office, I'm trying to get more papers to hand out or even more posters up in the waiting room just so people are exposed to it more and more. I gave a grand rounds to a lot of the family med doctors going through all these controversies with low fat. And a lot of doctors now are getting on board with it, and it's helping things out. Because if a patient's told their entire life they should be eating no fat whatsoever and bread's okay and pasta, and then they come into your office and you tell them the exact opposite, I mean, they're not going to believe me. They're going to think there's something wrong with me. So I think the grassroots efforts are going to help greatly. More questions? Oh, one more.
What is your favorite fat?
My favorite fat? I have to say that lard is my favorite fat. No. Lard or raw 100% grass-fed butter. I mean, you can cook anything with that and it makes it taste delicious. I mean, foods as a kid I wouldn't touch. I can't wait to get home and make them now, so.
Time for one more question.
Oh.
What's been the response from the medical community that's associated with the cancer societies? Because this seems like it's an existential threat to what they stand for.
When I was actually going to say this too in the talk, but when I first gave a talk like this, there was literally tomatoes thrown at me. And it was, we have no clue. It's not going to affect radiation. It's not going to do all these things. I gave this talk, so I started at UPMC a year ago, and I gave this talk when I got there, a similar talk. And the head of neuro-oncology there emailed me after and said, we need to get trials, so people are more interested because people like Dominic D'Agostino and these other people are showing the science. So it's not just me showing 1950s papers, though that actually has an impact as well with these physicians. So they're all for it. Most of the papers I submit, most of my research proposals that I submit are not looked upon that favorably by the higher up places. I submitted a grant a week ago. So maybe hopefully I'll be eating my words and they'll approve it. But yeah, I hear you. It's not where we need it to be.